All right, picking up from the prior video, we were talking about the causes of the decline in unionism, and there are other factors beyond the three we've talked about so far. One is relaxed union organization efforts. This theory suggests that unions may not be as aggressive as they were in the past in exciting workers and getting them to see the benefits of unions. Another factor is the individualistic versus a collectivist culture. The US tends to be much more individualistic than many other countries, especially those of Europe that have higher unionization. That's a almost ideology. And when you have an ideology that is more individualistic, unions become less attractive because unions have the effect of homogenizing workers. So if you're a worker, you might want to negotiate with your employer individually. You might want to say, hey, I've got a degree, I've got experience, I'm working hard, I'm different than everybody else, and negotiate for better pay and working conditions. But when you join a union, you don't negotiate individually. You negotiate through a collective bargaining agreement, on behalf of everybody. So you relinquish that that individual ability to self-negotiate. Relative importance. The evidence suggests that the total decline in unionization is due to structural changes, about 40% of the drop, increased managerial opposition, another 40% of the drop, and then the remaining 20% is the substitution hypothesis and these other factors. So how have unions responded? Well, one, they've merged. A lot of the unions in this country are small. They're chapters that may have hundreds or a few thousand employees that they represent. Well, that weakens their ability to really unify workers. So they've merged into larger unions. In fact, 80% of all of the unions out there are unified under the AFL-CIO, which is the major kind of umbrella organization for unions in the US. That's helped them a bit, but it still hasn't led to the kind of support that they need to keep their union numbers up. They've increased their organizing efforts by targeting white-collar workers. For the longest time, unions have been pushing blue-collar workers because those were the workers that were most receptive to collective bargaining. But white-collar workers make up a big part of the economy now. And so unions have tried to get them on board as well. It's a tougher sell with white-collar workers, and that kind of goes back to this problem here. White-collar workers usually bring unique talents and experience and education to the job that they want to market. They don't want to be homogenized with all the other workers and have a collective bargaining agent negotiating on their behalf. And then the other thing they've done, unions have done, is avoided strikes and used worker slowdown instead. Strikes are the weapon that unions have to get results, get the firm to accept their terms. But they also create a lot of resentment on the part of consumers. And I remember when they had the grocery store strikes here in San Diego years ago. You had all these cashiers in front of the stores blocking entry and shouting in people's faces, and it just didn't come across to a lot of customers as a positive thing. It made the workers look like they were adversarial. And so that hurts the image of the union. And what the unions have done instead is to try to lower that resistance, to get more support across a broader array of the population by not getting in people's face and by not doing picketing and things like that, preventing people from shopping in the stores they like. The worker slowdowns are going to have a similar effect. You just have the workers work less. They're still on the job, they're doing it, but they're doing it at a slower pace. So it does hurt the firm, but instead of a complete walkout, a strike, the firm experiences it in a slowdown instead. Sometimes you'll see these slowdowns referred to as working to contract. In other words, if the union is trying to negotiate for a better contract, then they'll tell their employees, only work to the current contract. Don't do anything in addition to that. All right, let's take a look at how unions raise wages, or how they attempt to raise wages. There's two ways they could do this. One would be by raising the demand for labor. This is going to be a tough call, but if they could do this, they would not only increase wages, they would also increase employment in the industry. So if we start out here at W0 and Q0, if somehow, some way the union was able to shift demand to the right, up, then that would raise wages and create jobs in that industry. Now, how might you do that? Well, anything that would shift the demand for the labor to the right. And here's the list. By increasing the product demand, the unions would be able to increase demand for labor. Remember, labor demand is derived demand. It comes from the product that sells. So if the demand for, let's say, automobiles increases, well, that will increase the demand for the labor that produces automobiles. The way to do this, one way to do this, is to promote legislation to increase government purchases of union-provided products. Government has a big budget. If you can get the government to buy union-produced products, then that will shift demand for the products and demand for the workers. They can promote subsidies on private sector purchases of union-provided goods, again, using government as a means to incentivize private purchases of union-provided goods. You might see this in the auto industry, where back in the Great Recession, the government actually did subsidize cars. They said, look, if you buy a car, we'll give you a certain amount of money to put towards that car. It had to be a fuel-efficient car, that kind of thing. And so by giving people that money, people went out and bought cars, raising the demand for cars and raising the demand for union workers that was producing those cars. And then also lobby for tariffs and quotas on foreign goods. Again, get government involved by reducing the competition of foreign goods so that people are forced to buy domestic goods where the unions would be producing the products. Another thing they can do is increase productivity. If you can get workers to be more productive and shift this curve to the right. Remember, the demand curve is the marginal revenue product curve. So it shows us the productivity of the worker. How might you enhance productivity through unions? Well, unions will claim that by unionizing, they're creating an environment for workers to participate in the company. In other words, unions don't just negotiate for higher wages and fringe benefits. They also negotiate for worker democracy, co-determination, or quality circles, as these are sometimes called, so that workers are involved in the decision-making, and that gives them a sense of interest in the company that otherwise wouldn't be there, a sense of control, and maybe even a sense that the company cares about them to a greater extent. The theory is if that enhances productivity, then it will reveal itself in terms of higher demand, higher productivity, right? Shifting up for the demand curve. Another thing they can do to increase demand is to influence the price of related inputs. Interestingly, unions will often try to lobby for higher minimum wages. You say, well, why would they do that? Most minimum wage workers are not unionized. But by raising the minimum wage, they actually make workers that are not unionized less substitutable for unionized workers. Here's a simple example. Let's say you have a union worker that makes $20 an hour, and that job can be done by two non-union workers for, let's say, a minimum wage of $10 each. So the company says, well, we can hire two workers at $10 each, and they can do that job, non-union workers, or we can hire one union worker at $20 each, and they can do that job. Well, that makes the two workers interchangeable with the one union worker. But if you raise the wage, the minimum wage, to $12, well, then the firm says, well, if we hire the two workers to replace the one union worker, it's going to cost us $24, right? 12 times 2. So they're not going to do that. They'd rather hire the union worker and pay him $20 an hour. So by raising the minimum wage, you actually make less substitutes available for union workers. Davis-Bacon Act. This act requires federal contractors to pay the prevailing union wage scale. So if there's going to be say a new interstate highway extension put in, let's say here in San Diego, well, that would be a federal project. And it's in San Diego, so they'd be hiring workers from San Diego. But the federal contractors would have to pay the prevailing union wage scale. They couldn't pay less than the union wage scale, which means that the contractors could not get labor for cheaper than what unions are negotiating for, which gives unions less competition. Another factor that could increase the demand for workers would be increasing the number of employers. The employers are the businesses that employ the workers. So if you can get more employers in an area, you're going to have more opportunities and more demand for workers. One way to do this is to promote industrial revenue bonds. So unions might want to lobby government in a locality to try to promote these bonds, which are in essence where the local government borrows money and then channels that money to private business. Another thing would be to promote property tax breaks. Tell businesses that if they come to the local area, they might get a discount on property taxes. Now, an example of this would be in the construction industry, where you might have developers that maybe aren't doing a lot of stuff in San Diego, and then San Diego says, well, you know what, we're going to go ahead and we're going to issue these industrial revenue bonds. We're going to generate some funds, and we'll use those funds to build the sidewalks and build the streets and build kind of the community area if you, the developer, will come here and build the homes. Or they might say, when you build those homes here, we're going to give you a break on the property taxes. You won't have as much of a property tax bill. Both of those things would help encourage the developers to locate in San Diego and create jobs at the same time. So unions are political entities. They often use government as a means to get this kind of result. So what unions would do is they would promote these things. They would try to lobby government at the local, state, and sometimes even federal level to incentivize businesses to employ their workers. All of these things here are potential ways of increasing the demand for labor and shifting that demand curve up, raising wages and creating jobs. It's not a very easy thing to do. A lot of these have to do with things way outside the control of the union, increasing product demand, enhancing productivity, influencing the price of related inputs, and increasing the number of employers. They might be able to make a small dent in these things, but not a big enough one to significantly raise wages. So what they usually rely on is this effect. Instead of shifting demand to the right, they shift supply to the left. If we start out at W0 and Q0, we move supply to the left, we raise wages, W0 to W1. Now the downside here is we actually lose jobs. We go from Q0 to Q1. So that's often the trade-off that unions have to make. They do raise wages for their workers, but the means through which they do this is often coming at the cost of less jobs. Let's look at how they would decrease the labor supply. Well, one way to do this is to reduce the number of people that can actually supply labor in an industry. So unions are known for lobbying for laws that reduce immigration. Okay, immigrants might be a substitute for their workers. Reduce child labor. Children, young people might be a substitute for labor, and reducing the length of the work week. And by reducing the length of the work week, you end up creating more jobs than would otherwise be available. I mean, if everybody's working 40 hours, there's a lot more jobs available than if everybody's working 60 hours. Another thing would be to limit entry into occupations through long apprenticeships and residency requirements. Unions sometimes promote more rigorous standards for entry into a field, licensing. For example, with the American Medical Association, which is not a union, but it's very close. It's what we call a craft or a union. And what they do is they lobby Washington to limit the amount of medical schools that are out there. They limit the access to those medical schools, and they raise the training standards and all of that stuff. And some of it is good because from the standpoint of the consumer, we want, competent professionals. So occupational licensing and these high standards help. But some of it's bad from the consumer standpoint because it reduces the amount of competition in that industry, and it therefore raises the wages. See, it shifts the supply curve for doctors to the left, raises those wages. And then they can also raise non-wage income. By raising things like Social Security or disability or unemployment, some people are going to leave the labor market, reducing the supply of labor and therefore raising the wages for, shifting to the left, the supply curve, raising wages for their workers. So these are tactics that are usually more effective in getting those wages up than otherwise shifting demand. All right, guys, that's it. We'll pick up in the next video. Thanks.